Hello, Brad Smith from The Way. So this Sunday at The Way, we're going to be talking about an issue that is universal in scope, and that is the issue of suffering. And as difficult as suffering is to talk about, because it is universal, it is equally a difficult subject to talk about because it's a sensitive subject, because nobody wants to suffer, yet everybody is suffering in some way or has suffered in some way. And people have struggled over the years to account for suffering. How do you explain suffering? How do you, in the light of who God is God a good God? Is he an impotent God that cannot prevent suffering? How do you relate God and suffering? Those are difficult questions to ask. C.S. Lewis even wrote a book called The Problem of Pain, and pain is a problem when you think about suffering, if you don't think about suffering in a biblical way. The Bible tells us that God's ways are not our ways. His ways are higher than our ways. They're better than our ways. They're different than our ways. God's ways are completely different than man's ways. And we got to think about suffering in God's ways, because when we look at suffering, we see difficulty, we see hardship, we see persecution, and we automatically think bad, that suffering is bad in some way, or there's something wrong if I am suffering in some way. It's kind of like when the disciples were going along, and there was the man born blind since birth, and they said, well, who sinned, this man or his parents? Somebody must have sinned, or this man wouldn't be suffering. That's almost called it's a hint of retribution theology we see in the friends of Job, in the book of Job as well. Well, Job, you're suffering, so obviously you must have sinned. Suffering occurs for a lot of different reasons. I can't capture them all in a very short period, but really the ultimate source of our suffering is sin, and as sin is universal, so is suffering. Sin has distorted the nature of the world, creation, God's creation. Therefore, we're afflicted with things like disease, we're afflicted with things like hurricanes and tornadoes, and really just the disintegration of the world because of sin induces a lot of suffering. Sin has natural consequences. God has said, this is the way to live. These are the ways you ought to live. And when we deviate from God's plan, the natural condition is that we would suffer in some way. God has said, this is the way, but we say, never mind, we'll do our things our way. And the natural side effect is that we would suffer. Maybe we're suffering under the hand of discipline from God, and that God is not content to let his children languish in their sins, and so at some point he comes and chastises and disciplines us and rebukes us. So maybe we're suffering under the weight of discipline from God. And the ultimate authority as to why we suffer is because God has decided it to be so, as God is sovereign over all things. And this is the difficult part to reconcile. God in his sovereignty has ordained all things that come to pass, including our suffering, and that's just hard to understand when you think about it. How do you reconcile that aspect of God's sovereignty? So this Sunday at The Way, we're going to talk about suffering, and we're going to try to flip it on its head and talk about it from a different perspective of the blessing of suffering. The blessing of suffering. So hey, if you're in Clarksville, come see us at The Way this Sunday. Otherwise, find a church and get there. If you're a man, take your families to church. God bless.